As Activision Blizzard continues to be embroiled in controversy due to its work culture of harassment, plenty of other developers from other studios are becoming less afraid to speak out, and media outlets are more actively investigating these situations and bring to the surface stories that should have been brought to the surface a long time ago. IGN is among those outlets who recently covered the toxic work culture at Bungie, the developers of Destiny, and while developers have expressed that there are definitely signs of improvement, there's still a long way to go, and the stuff that has happened in the past few years has unfortunately just been unacceptable, and you'll see why in a bit. The article here is titled "The Battle for Bungie's Soul Inside the Studio Struggle for a Better Work Culture." And as we scroll down, we'll find all of the details relayed in this extensive article by IGN. If you want to read it for yourself, I'll link it in the description below. But as usual, I'll highlight the key points of this article, comment along the way, share my thoughts, and whatnot. So, before we begin, the first thing I'd like to highlight is this series of tweets by the official Bungie Twitter, which was published after the DFEH's report against Activision Blizzard, and this was basically Bungie saying this stuff's unacceptable, we stand with the Activision Blizzard workers, and the general stance that harassment is not acceptable in the games industry. This is how the series of tweets reads. Bungie is built on empowering our people no matter who they are, where they're from, or how they identify. We have a responsibility to acknowledge, reflect, and do what we can to push back on a persistent culture of harassment, abuse, and inequality that exists in our industry. It's our responsibility to ensure this type of behavior is not tolerated at Bungie at any level, and that we never excuse it or sweep it under the rug. While the accounts in this week's news are difficult to read, we hope they will lead to justice, awareness, and accountability. We have a zero-tolerance policy at Bungie for environments that support this toxic culture, and we are committed to rooting them out to defend those who are at risk. Women, POC, and underrepresented communities have nothing to gain by reliving their trauma. We believe them when they come forward with reports of abuse and harassment. We don't pretend that Bungie is perfect and that no one has experienced harassment while working here, but we will not tolerate it and will confront it head on, and will continue to do the work every day to be better. Our goal is to continue to improve the experience for everyone working at Bungie and do our part to make the gaming industry as a whole to be more welcoming. As you'll soon see, this is a statement that many Bungie employees scoffed at because of its hypocrisy. Everything they say they stand for, and how there's zero tolerance for it, Bungie itself has perpetuated in the past few years, and that's why so many employees have spoken out about all of the harassment and abuse, as well as the discrimination, especially against women, but also people of color and varying genders. It's pretty rough to read, but it's stuff that needs to be out there in the hopes that the industry at large understands that this shit can no longer fly. Next thing I want to briefly highlight is this statement from Bungie that was published on September 29th, 2001, titled Diversity, Inclusion, Learnings, and Updates. And here they basically outline everything going on in the industry, all of the talks about abuse, misconduct, discrimination, you name it, and steps that Bungie itself is attempting to take in order to mitigate that within their own studio. And this was something that was, according to IGN's article, and we're going to delve into the main story now, was lauded across the industry, but the response from within the company was different, with many feeling like the image that Bungie was putting out there through their statements didn't actually reflect the reality of working in Bungie. For many, hiring a diversity and inclusion director or ending mandatory arbitration in all employee contracts was far too little, far too late. It was only one step on a long journey to a potentially better future. So IGN spoke to a number of sources. This is an investigative report. They spoke to 26 current and former employees that have worked at Bungie within the last decade. So a wide range of both former and current employees across many, many years. And they have all expressed essentially how issues like overt sexism, boys club culture, crunch, and HR protection of abusers, as well as more complex stories of microaggression, systemic inequalities, and difficulties in being heard, are commonplace and have been commonplace within the studio. Though again, at the same time, there are some who believe that there is potential for steady improvement and for positive change, but they were candid that there's still a long way to go, many challenges that the company faces to get to where it needs to be. This article places a particular emphasis on the narrative team, which is among the most toxic of departments within Bungie, though certainly not the only one, and people who worked in that department experienced toxic leadership, issues with crunch, and at times unmanageable separation between ideas of old Bungie and new Bungie culture, and more, all within the last 5 or 6 years. And many of these issues go as far back as the development of Destiny 1. You may recall that there were many troubled elements that were detailed in this Kotaku article by Jason Schreier, the messy true story behind the making of Destiny. One of the things that happened is that the story got rebooted, and that obviously got in the way of the development pipeline, and there were a lot of issues in the narrative department as well as plenty of other departments, and that was a very just troubled project. And now we're getting additional context as it is revealed that a narrative team lead during Destiny 1's development, who appeared to suffer massive burnout during the project, created an increasingly toxic work environment for others on the team. And it was so bad that team members kept a countdown of days since his last explosion on a whiteboard, kind of like how workplaces have, 0 days or however many days since the last incident, or how The Simpsons has, 0 days since accident at the power plant. It was like that bad that they were keeping track of this stuff on a freaking whiteboard, with many of IGN's sources recalling one particular incident in which he threw a chair at a window because he felt other people were ruining his creative vision and trying to deviate from his narrative ideas. And even after all that, he stayed at the studio for several years and was invited to do contract work on Destiny 2. So at this point, he wasn't in a senior position in the narrative team, but he would frequently issue narrative direction despite no longer being a senior team member, and would become angry when he felt the Destiny 2 writers were deviating from his original vision for Destiny 1. So this guy very much wasn't a team player, and on top of that, he had anger issues. One source told a story of him yelling at her over the phone so aggressively that she was brought to tears. She subsequently refused to be on phone calls with him without a third party present, reasonably so. And beyond bringing this Destiny 1 narrative lead back for Destiny 2, because of the burnout surrounding Destiny 1, tons of people left from the narrative department, and so Bungie had to assemble a new team for Destiny 2, and this time it was staffed by more women and people of color at a ratio higher than many other teams at the largely white and male Bungie. But even then, discriminatory dominance very much existed, as this was a time period when a series of white male leaders were at the helm, and they made life miserable for their writers for years, report IGN's numerous sources. Among those sources is an ex-Bungie employee who was willing to be named Cookie Hiponia, who on top of being a woman, she's also discriminated for being a woman of color. And the horrific stories she relayed weren't just in isolation, they were actually corroborated by a number of others as well. She became a full-time employee on the narrative team through 2019, and she recalled just a lack of efficiency with this team. They just had a bunch of people who wrote things and kind of had the run of the place, and there was just a general lack of professionalism. One leader from earlier in this period was accused of being a sexist nightmare by an anonymous source. He yelled in meetings and would throw papers across tables, would frequently rewrite things at the last minute, and writers wouldn't learn about changes to their work until after voice lines had already been recorded, which is a waste of time for the writers and also for the voice actors who have to come in and re-record some stuff, and that also means wasted money. And anyone who complained against this one specific leader for their behavior were told by him that they needed thicker skins and to learn how to take criticism, even though an anger tantrum and generally demeaning your cohort isn't considered criticism. That's just toxic behavior that you see and some of the worst people on the internet, for example. There are accounts of him calling one woman on the team an unmanageable bitch, and another source relayed that he was literally the worst person I've ever worked for. I mean, one has to be pushed to the limit for them to be able to say literally the worst person I've ever worked for, given all of the awful bosses that exist not just in the gaming industry, but other industries as well. So, yeah. This is a pretty bad situation. Now, while he was eventually let go, unfortunately, he was replaced by similarly antagonizing men who frequently made sexist remarks, complained about reverse sexism, made homophobic remarks to a queer colleague, openly mocked team members' ideas in meetings, then would play his mockery off as if it was a joke. I've met people like this, people who will genuinely demean someone and then back off and be like, it's just a joke, buddy. Don't take it so seriously, as a means to ensure that they can continue to berate and demean this person continuously under the guise of a joke that isn't really a joke, just an excuse to keep being abusive. And this individual would also take credit for work others had done, and Hiponia, specifically the employee who named herself, recalled being discriminated upon as her work duties were handed off to a new Bungie employee, and when she asked, why did you ask somebody else to do it, the response that she got was, I'm just joking around, as if matters relating to your job and your performance in a professional environment can at any point in time be deemed a joke. She also faced awful behavior from a third narrative lead who was called callous, hierarchical, authoritarian, incurious, cruel leader, and Hyponia specifically relayed how he would frequently ask her to do secretarial and administrative tasks, things that were not in her purview as someone who was in the position of being a writer and editor on the team. Her job was to edit and write, not to do all of this secretarial stuff. That isn't part of her job, but he made her do that stuff anyway. And just generally, this third narrative lead was frequently insulting people who stood up for themselves. At one point, he separated and cornered an employee who stood up to him to yell at them. Multiple sources also said that he regularly made racist remarks, and namely a number of inappropriate quips about Latin American gangs. Hyponia then detailed the chaos surrounding the Destiny 2 narrative team and how much burnout and turnover there was over that project with, constant content releases as part of this live service format. And Hyponia noted how they struggled to get narrative contractors hired full-time to help ease the burden on the team because she was repeatedly denied requests to bring on new full-time team members, and contracts would often not be renewed or extended in time, resulting in months-long periods where the department was left understaffed. This was a department that was in desperate need of more manpower, and something that Bungie was just not willing to provide, or were negligent enough in their responsibilities for the narrative team that it resulted in pipelines getting clogged up for this department. Reports of crunch are also commonplace among these sources: 60, 70, 80, even 100-hour weeks during some expansion, no breaks in between crunch periods. One team member crunched while so sick that they were unable to type and had to have someone else type for them while they dictated, and this company had them go into work anyway when they were in this pretty bad shape. And when the team was told not to crunch, they were unfortunately put in a precarious position, especially after the rough release of Destiny 2's first DLC expansion, Curse of Osiris, which was singled out for its writing and the story just not being good, which led to community members sending harassment, death threats, and vitriol to employees at Bungie, particularly women who didn't receive support inside the studio or from the community team for what they were going through. There's just so much that's outside of the control of these ground floor employees working in departments like the narrative team, who get all of this hate, who get all of this undeserved vitriol, and Bungie higher-ups didn't have the balls to back him up and relay that, decision makers and leaders ultimately have a large influence on why games launch in the state that they do, while ground floor workers are doing what they're being told to do in the conditions and circumstances that they're given, which, they don't have all that much control over. And it's not just that Bungie wasn't supporting them, they were actively working against them, with one member of leadership still at the studio emailing Reddit comments about these women to other company leaders in a bid to tear down the narrative team because players didn't like the story. So instead of supporting and encouraging them, this leader went out of his way to essentially disparage these people behind their backs to other departments and essentially create more hostility within the studio. And the narrative team, feeling this hostility not just from the community but from within Bungie itself, were afraid to ship something that was subpar in its writing, even under the mandate of don't crunch. And so some would force themselves to crunch, some of them going so far as to hide the overtime from their leads so they wouldn't enforce story cuts. They had to crunch while pretending not to crunch to get the story quality to a level that they were satisfied with. And this is a failure of leadership, of poor schedule management, and of setting unrealistic expectations, and just fostering hostility against a narrative team that are constrained in the amount of time that they have to do their work. And with all the last-minute rewrites, the narrative team's lives would just be made that much harder and that much worse. All further exacerbated by Bungie's old guard being especially precious about the vision of Destiny 1 and them wanting to steer the narrative in the direction that they perceive that this series should go in, even though a lot of the ideas that they have on their minds aren't explicitly defined in the game or elsewhere, but only existed as ideas in the heads of people who no longer worked in narrative. There was also a dissonance between the main writing team and then the cinematics writing team. Cinematics are apparently written separately from the main writing team in a star chamber, resulting in disconnects between established lore, planned quest narratives, and major story beats. The cinematic team's decisions would often override decisions made by the narrative team, forcing last-minute rewrites and more crunch. So the narrative team was put through the grinder as a result of just piss-poor management. There are also employees within the studio who fought back against men within the narrative team wanting to be degrading or tone-deaf or casually sexist against certain female characters, pushing storylines that leaned on harmful stereotypes of women and mental health struggles, often despite objections from women and supportive allies across the studio. There's one quote from a source who relayed their frustration by stating, "I could go on for a long time about all of the ways women have been made to stand by, as the men on the team have written characters in baffling, unrecognizable ways. The women who could best write the characters whose gender are representative of them were set aside so that the men could imbue their fantasies or their prejudices against women in those characters." You know what I mean? Like, they didn't let the women provide input for the women characters. It's just freaking baffling. Discrimination also happened against different sexualities, with one character, Devon B, a scout players meet, having a piece of dialogue, or initially having a piece of dialogue, where he would say that he is missing his partner, and someone high up at the studio noticed this specific line and demanded it be taken out because they wouldn't be able to ship the game in Russia or China because of the implication of gay romance. So basically bending the knee to the international overlords and their big markets through which tons of profit can be generated. So this demand led to the line being adjusted so that Devrim talks about someone named Mark, and this line was something that was praised because turns out people picked up on the implication that this could be a gay character, and basically Bungie took the credit for something they were trying to prevent but inadvertently made it so that this character would come off as a gay character. Bungie leadership had tried to stop it, but then got to enjoy positive attention anyway, and so one source was just really furious that the same entities working against this would be the ones taking credit for it. Then we have more information about the abusive leadership within the writing team, members of which were routinely told they were difficult to work with, not supportive enough of their leaders, or were aggressive or abrasive and needed to be better at taking criticism. So if you had any constructive criticism to share against the leaders, then you're just a bad sport. That's how they represented this situation. It's basically that mentality of the leaders know what they're doing, just listen to them and don't be so difficult to work with. I'm sorry, but sometimes leaders falter and they need team members below them to hold them accountable. Now here's something really messed up and very clearly discriminatory. The woman of color employee, Hipponia, one of the stories she shared was that she was having difficulty getting promoted simply because she wasn't good enough at the game, even though she's part of the narrative team whose job and responsibilities don't tie into gameplay and combat design and the like. It'd be like saying a concept artist isn't allowed to get a promotion because they're not good enough at the game, even though their job is just to create evocative visuals to represent concepts that will hopefully come to life in the finished version of what they're developing. Hell, despite this BS, Hipponia was patient enough to express her desire to get better at the game and asked to be given time at work to play and improve, since apparently this is part of her job, but her request was denied. And so much of her time at the studio was bad enough that her stress level skyrocketed and increased her need for anti-anxiety medication and therapy, resulting in stress-related gastrointestinal issues that required surgery, and Hipponia wasn't alone. A number of employees faced similar degradation of health because of what an awful place Bungie was to work. By 2019, the entire writing staff, in a desperate move, tried to appeal to HR in the hopes that they will help them out, but once again they were told that they needed to try working harder with the people who were making their lives miserable daily, despite the team reiterating that the leads did not appear to be making efforts to build these same bridges on their end. This was not a two-way street. The writing team were trying, though were not being reciprocated. They even wrote to CEO Pete Parsons, but he didn't bother to even respond. It wasn't until drastic action was taken, until multiple writers quit or threatened to quit all at once, that Bungie finally dismissed the leads responsible for the chaos and began to take the team's concerns more seriously. This is how it is with all of these corporations. It's only when their bottom line has the potential to be affected that they'll finally take action. Once these writers threatened to quit all at once, that could obviously financially affect Bungie as a corporation, because that would severely impair the development pipeline of Destiny 2. That's what it seems like they were more worried about than just human decency and morals. Now, fortunately, following that incident, things have improved according to the narrative team and according to what was relayed to IGN, though it is highlighted that it ultimately took a sacrifice of many people's careers and mental and emotional well-being to get it there. And even while we're here, we still haven't gone far enough. There's very much a slow-moving progress. Now, this article focuses a lot on the narrative team, but it's important to note that sources pointed to issues within almost every major team at the company, not just narrative. Issues that were bad enough that people have been pointing out the hypocrisy behind Bungie's tenet in a similar fashion to how people have called out Activision Blizzard's hypocrisy over Blizzard's tenets of how every voice matters and the like, which has proven to be woefully untrue, especially in recent months and years. Bungie has a tenet that says teams are stronger than heroes. We hold ourselves and each other to the highest standard of mutual respect, inclusivity, and support, knowing that teams whose members speak their mind and take risks will accomplish what no individual ever could. Our wins are always team wins, except there are plenty of people within Bungie who are not team players, people in power who think they're in charge and the feedback from below is meaningless and isn't of value, and they discriminate who they take feedback from instead of treating the team as a team. There are definitely heroes here who are trying to outshine everyone else. CEO Parsons claimed that Bungie doesn't put up with this kind of rockstar culture, which is also very much prevalent at Activision Blizzard. Basically, the rockstar devs and heads and leads, they could get away with murder, basically. They could get away with anything because they got special treatment and the policies didn't apply to them. And the same was the case for the rock stars at Bungie. To many employees, it felt like those who reached that status could basically get away with anything. And much like with Activision Blizzard and all of these other studios who have been facing harassment allegations, protected by either those above them in the leadership chain or long-serving HR employees. Which is why one former employee understandably laughed when they read Bungie's response to Activision Blizzard, referring to this series of tweets that I referenced earlier in the video, where they talked about how they have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of stuff, except they tolerated plenty from the Rockstar members of the Bungie team. Someone else who got heavily criticized is a top-level company leader who had been with Bungie since Halo, was described as an asshole, constantly disparaged others, dismissive of those who brought up the company's toxic culture, didn't bother to learn anyone's names, whose inappropriate work wardrobe at one point included a shirt that advertised free lap rides, was seen getting incredibly drunk at company events, would clip his toenails at his desk, which is pretty gross and unprofessional. And this guy rose to the company's topmost levels before being quietly let go after years of issues. An ambiguous company email announcing his departure was how people found out about this. And that's another thing. Companies rarely tend to give abusers a dishonorable discharge. They tend to try to keep it quiet or try to paint this as, oh man, we're going to miss this guy kind of scenario, when someone like this should not be missed at all. And the fact that someone like this could rise so high and would only be let go after years of this stuff happening goes to show why so many employees are burning out from the gaming industry and from work environments like this, because this stuff is just relentless. And dealing with this stuff for years, I mean, I can't even begin to imagine how insufferable that is. Another individual who's been with Bungie since Halo 3 rose to a director-level role throughout the Destiny game's production, but he was also an asshole, excessively abusive to his team, with some noting that his team seemed to work more late nights than others, and one described him as just torturing his staff. You really have to go out of your way to be a bad boss and bad manager to be described as someone who just tortures his staff. Multiple instances of sexist and racist remarks, and just the tendency to intimidate employees in one-on-one meetings and viciously berate his team when work didn't meet his standards. And stuff like this was commonplace throughout the various departments within Bungie. They would dismiss bad behavior complaints against those they favored. The rockstar devs would get special treatment. And of course, HR was completely useless throughout all of this. Any reports that'd be sent their way, HR would be unwilling to help. This was a recurring theme from the sources that IGN contacted, and there's one Bungie employee in HR who would actively protect harmful individuals to the point where multiple people perceived his job to be to make it all go away. The cleanup guy, basically. The Saul Goodman of the HR crew. The criminal lawyer, if you will.
Seriously, when the going gets tough, you don't want a criminal lawyer, right? You want a criminal lawyer.
And so naturally, there's been a near universal distrust of HR, and even by awful standards within the games industry, people within Bungie say that Bungie HR was for many on a different level, even worse than some of the other companies who've been accused of similar things. With the general sentiment being that HR generally exists to protect the company, and that's almost always the case. And sometimes people who go to HR wouldn't just have their reports cleaned up, there would be hostility against them. I've watched it happen a few times at Bungie where someone went to HR and things went completely sideways for them. Like, this is some like mobster level stuff we're dealing with here. It wasn't just burying issues under the rug, it was just blatant retribution as well. Then we have more reports of how women were discriminated against, an environment where many men cultivated a pervasive atmosphere in which women were inferior. In some ways that was apparent was how women were disproportionately talked over frequently, had their ability to do their jobs questioned, had their ideas ignored and then used by men who later took credit for them. There's one female source who recalled being that one person who, no matter what feedback she'd give or what questions she'd ask, nobody would acknowledge her existence, basically. And another source had the following quote to share: a lot of women were put on what I would call unappealing projects that were going to end up having major crunch issues, maybe even potentially quality issues, things that were not even funded very well, things that were not going to succeed in a way that would allow them to shine in a review period. Basically, women were often set up to fail in their profession and their career. There are also reports of men in upper management giving code names to females that find attractive, nicknames that they'd openly use behind their backs to other employees, and a lot of these names obviously were pretty derogatory references to their physical form, hair color, or outright derogatory terms. There's one producer who didn't know the meaning of personal space, making sexist comments, openly talking about his love life, asking colleagues to comment on images of women he brought up on Tinder. I mean, just what a sad and insecure individual this man must be. Though of course someone like him would skyrocket through the ranks at Bungie because of how charismatic and well-liked he was among Bungie's old guard. He was so well-liked by Bungie's old guard and people in positions of power that any criticism against his behaviors would fall on deaf ears. He was eventually fired, but even then a number of his friends would talk about it like it was unjustified, saying that this was a good guy who got taken out by political correctness. Human decency shouldn't be a political issue. It's just human decency that this individual very clearly lacked. It's called personal space, boundaries, respect, professionalism, none of which this individual seemed to have. But yeah, his cohort suggested women who reported him just need to get a sense of humor, just need to deal with the insult and the disparaging way that men behave against them. Because it's all a joke, right? What's the big deal? Again, just an excuse to keep perpetuating abusive behavior. One male employee was so bad about personal space, continuously making inappropriate comments and giving out unwanted hugs, being lovey-dovey when it's convenient for him, but when in meetings, belittling them and shutting them down. This man was bad enough on these fronts that women actually had to post signage at their desks reminding both him and others to stay out of their personal space. Actually put out a sign saying, "This person is not allowed in here." And just like other abusers in positions of power, this individual was eventually let go, but it took far too long. It took a number of years. Now, going back to the named employee Hipponia, from 2016 to 2018, she became part of an internal diversity committee. Half the members were actually composed of people who genuinely want to partake in this organization to drive positive change, but the other half was made up of company leaders, all white, who essentially infiltrated this organization, who Hipponia and other sources say put roadblocks in at every turn, actively working against the push for better change. And beyond discriminating against women, people of color, transgenders, people with varying sexualities, you name it, they also discriminated against people with physical or mental health issues. Bungie was not only unaccommodating, but at times actively hostile. One individual with health issues was forced to self-medicate with leftover medication from previous surgery because they weren't allowed to take any more time off to address or alleviate these issues during crunch. The priority being the video game and the money it stands to make rather than the human being who has a health issue that needs to be addressed. People who'd be in a bad mood because they're grieving over the death of a family member would be penalized during the review period for being abrasive and uncommunicative, basically penalized for having a natural reaction to losing someone they loved. Folks in the autism spectrum struggled with receiving negative feedback without concrete direction on how to improve communications. They were castigated for things that they cannot help and were not given any guidance to improve. And then two individuals apparently described situations where they took time off to deal with either personal or familial health issues, but were penalized when they got back. They were moved to a less desirable project because I guess they were seen as lazy or not a team player for dealing with genuine, pressing familial or health issues. They treat these people like they're drones and tools who don't have any emotions, who can have a bad day or a bad time period. Then we got more reports of high levels of anxiety and health degradation attributed to crunch, which the studio claimed back in 2017 in this games industry article titled Bungie's 13-Year Battle with Crunch Culture, that this was something they were no longer going to tolerate, something they were actively seeking to resolve, claiming that Halo 2's brutal crunch led to a new way of thinking about people management. Apparently not. And some people's mental health degraded enough in their tenure at Bungie that they felt the desire to take their own life. With Activision Blizzard, there was one employee who did after she was humiliated with pictures of her privates essentially being spread around during a Christmas party or something along those lines. If a company ever fosters a work environment where anyone feels like they want to take their own life and not live anymore because of how this work environment treated them, you have woefully, thoroughly messed up. You know what the saddest thing about all of this is? Even with all of these horror stories, one thing that sources consistently relate is that at least Bungie was better than many other game studios, and their horror stories, even though Bungie's stories sound pretty horrible as they are, you know, not necessarily at the level of Cosby Suite like with Activision Blizzard, though, as one woman put it, things don't need to be the worst case scenario for it to be bad. It doesn't matter that Bungie isn't as bad as Activision Blizzard. It's still bad enough that it needs to be looked into and be taken seriously. Just the idea that this article is representing a better version of a work culture of harassment that's far too commonplace in the games industry, I mean, that's a really sad state of affairs, and you can only imagine how much worse things are at other publishers and studios and companies. Now, IGN brings up an apology message that was published by Bungie CEO Pete Parsons in parallel to the IGN article, which I'm assuming he knew was coming given that he was interviewed about this story. And this is the apology in question, published on the same day, December 10th, 2021, where he apologized for the way this whole situation was mishandled and expressed some bullet points on ways that he plans to change and improve the studio, remove bad actors from our studio, focus on better planning and more reasonable release dates, efforts towards a stronger inclusion, diversity, and equity, reviews of our hiring, compensation, and promotion practices, tracking our team composition, and sharing the numbers openly with everyone, which sounds fine, but putting actions to words is a whole different matter. And that's where only time will tell, and whether they can execute all of this effectively enough to significantly and noticeably mitigate the awful work culture that they've fostered. And to Bungie's credit, apparently sources relate to IGN that quiet but deeply significant change has begun taking place in the last few years. One of the most important things is for the companies to start getting rid of the problematic people, and that's been happening more and more recently. They began to notice a number of more powerful problematic individuals leaving the company one by one. Many left quietly and professionally, a few even left on publicly positive terms. I don't know how that's possible if they're an abuser. But the one thing that's missing for former victims who feel betrayed and left behind is a general lack of accountability. Yes, they've been let go from Bungie, but they're going to find employment elsewhere. There is no castigation of their actions to prevent them from being abusers within the games industry. They shouldn't be working in this industry anymore if they've behaved like this and have hurt so many people. But they're going to walk away with a golden parachute, essentially, land somewhere safe and, you know, just take on a big position at another studio and potentially be abusive there as well. You need some kind of justice. That's what's absent. There is no catharsis, and I couldn't agree more with this sentiment. Though in other areas like diversity and inclusion, apparently employees have been noticing a noticeable positive change, with a significant push by the studio to start having measurable goals for the amount of diverse individuals in leadership positions, basically taking this initiative seriously instead of working against it. And apparently problems relating to crunch have slowly and steadily been improving in the last several years, according to sources that IGN contacted, as well as CEO Parsons himself. Another improvement is in the department of the company's town hall meetings, which is basically where employees can pose questions and employees can vote on others' questions, and the most popular ones get raised and get addressed by leadership. But before, the submissions weren't anonymous, so people were afraid to speak out. Now, with the addition of anonymity, sources said more people felt comfortable asking questions about issues of diversity, burnout, and toxic studio behavior. Though unfortunately, leadership did have the tendency to give lukewarm responses to serious issues. There is no point in allowing people to speak out if you're not going to respond to them in a serious or meaningful way. It's just noise that's being sent out into the void rather than feedback that's being received and then acted upon. Like, there's a senior member who had the audacity to say during one of these town hall meetings that in his experience, no one had ever come to him about toxicity and that the issue wasn't a serious one. Basically the excuse of, well, I haven't experienced any such thing, so it mustn't be an issue at all, except you're not the target of these issues because you are in a position of power. Now, going back to more optimistic aspects of things that are changing within the company, apparently employees are excited about Bungie's current incubation projects. There's one in particular that IGN doesn't specify that a lot of people are really excited about, was spoken about glowingly by those in the know. Incredibly diverse team of developers with a significant number of leadership roles held by underrepresented minorities. But on the other side of the fence, you've got another one of these incubation projects that felt like it was largely staffed through nepotistic practices of only hiring veterans and good friends, people in the circle and rock stars, whatever, which was a major point of contention for how Bungie carried itself in the past few years. And it looks like they're kind of doing it again with this one project. But with his other project, people seem happy with the way that's being managed. Generally, though, there seems to be enough progress happening that one source relayed if there was to be a change, it would have to be on the incubation project, showing that things can be built differently, and it gave many of our sources tentative hope for change, even as they emphasized the job was far from finished. CEO Bungie Parsons had a few remarks to share to IGN about all of this, and some key points to highlight include, I'm proud of the progress we have made, but it's not enough, and it has taken too long. It also does not sweep away the bad experiences people have had at our studio. We're not yet the studio we have the potential to become, but we are on our way. He chose the correct words, but will he take the correct actions to back up the words? That is always where the proof lies. And these sentiments were echoed by Bungie employees who said, don't just talk and make statements about these issues. Don't just talk to talk, walk the walk, and then we'll see whether you mean what you say. As this employee aptly relayed to IGN, listen to your employees that have been giving this feedback instead of just saying, please give us feedback, especially if you're not going to listen to it or provide lukewarm responses. Listen and act on it and tell us what actions you took. It seems like we're talking to the void, and especially listen to people of color and women. To close off the article, here is one more expression of the sentiment that there's a very clear line between saying and doing, with one source stating the tweet was so frustrating, referring to the series of tweets that try to paint themselves under a good light and being, all for zero tolerance against harassment when Bungie itself has partaken in that culture. The tweet was so frustrating because positioning yourself as we're not the problem in response to systemic industry-wide misogyny perpetuates the problem. And the passive mention of wrongdoing is disingenuous to the victims who were harmed on their watch. Stop denying the harm done to your current and ex-employees. Own your failures. Stop hiding them. We know it is known. Show us industry-defining progress in the treatment of marginalized employees that can't possibly be mistaken for virtue signaling. I want Bungie to be what it relentlessly, repeatedly required me to be. I want Bungie to be brave. And everyone just wants Bungie to be better. We want all of these studios who have had rough tidings because of awful PR, awful practices, you name it, to get better so that developers can be happy, so that customers and gamers can be happy, so that everyone can win in an environment where making games can feel more celebratory rather than like a minefield of predatory business practices or predatory employment practices, you name it. This should just be a far more positive landscape, though the road to that is being paved as this conversation continues to happen, as media outlets continue to be unrelenting in their investigations, as communities continue to call all this stuff out and criticize the people who deserve to be criticized, as government officials and investors and whatnot continue to scrutinize the companies and their actions. This is most explosive the conversation surrounding cultures of harassment, misconduct, abuse, and discrimination has gone. This feels like the best chance we've gotten yet to push for positive change, to really make these companies and executives kneel, making them understand the reckoning that's coming their way. And the hope is that videos like this, articles like the one IGN published, and all of these other media outlets' articles will continue paving that path until we get to where we need to get, because as things stand now, it's all just completely unacceptable, immoral, and gaming can just be better for everyone. Let's see if that future can come to pass. Fingers crossed. Only time will tell, but until then, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the revelations surrounding Bungie's work culture and how toxic and awful it's been in the past few years, though with improvements and progress happening slowly, steadily, and hopefully consistently all the way through. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.